Everyone, this is Andy Bromberg. You're listening to CoinList Chats. This is a show where we dive deep into the most impactful token projects, their influential leaders, and the latest trends in the crypto markets. This broadcast is brought to you by CoinList, a technology company where early adopters invest in and trade the best digital assets. On CoinList, you can participate in token sales, trade the top crypto assets, participate in hackathons, and use our custody services for the assets that we support. We're going to chat for a bit here with our very special guest today and then do some Q&A, probably about 45 minutes total. If you'd like to ask questions, there's a button on the bottom of your screen for Q&A. You can type them there and we will address them at the end of the episode. So let's dive in. Today we are joined by the inimitable Dr. Waterhouse of Orchid. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, hi, how's it going?
Good. We are here in part because of, good to see you too. We're here in part because of CoinList's recent listing of OXT, the Orchid token, on the CoinList trading platform, which we are very, very excited about. So you can go to CoinList.co right now and trade OXT. But more importantly, just because of all of the interesting work that the Orchid team is doing and what they are building. So could you give us a quick rundown of your background and where you've come from before we dive into the work that the Orchid team's doing and what technology it is that you're building?
Sure, thanks Andy, and thanks for hosting. So we've been working on Orchid for actually about 3 years, almost to the day actually. Before that, back in 2013, I was one of the co-founders of Pantera Capital and ran the venture fund there for 3 years. 2013 was an interesting time. We got a lot of sort of initial unfair access to the markets and interesting people, and managed to do some really interesting deals in the space, like relevant to some of the things we're looking at now. We were the first institutional investor in Zcash, and got to assist with building out that team and getting to know a lot of really interesting other people in the space. My original background, did a PhD in engineering at Cambridge in the late 90s and moved out to Silicon Valley, been here ever since in San Francisco. Worked on distributed systems in the early 2000s with Bill Joy at Sun after they acquired one of my startups. Worked on distributed storage there and used a lot of the similar techniques that people are using today in cryptocurrencies, but without the cryptocurrency. In terms of Orchid, we started this company 3 years ago, really focused on the same mission as we have right now, which is opening up the internet, trying to build a better, more private network that can access the whole internet. And there's really two challenges that we see and we continue to see. As one is censorship, which is your ability from anywhere in the world to access content that other people in the world can access. And secondly is surveillance, which is either from corporations or from governments or others, tracking your movements online, tracking your location, tracking just everything about you for different purposes. Governments using it for state control, and then corporations using it for ad tech and surveillance capitalism. We launched the network last year in December, initially partnered with Coinbase, and we're excited to get on the Coinbase consumer and pro and earn programs. And then more recently, OKEx, Bittrex Global, and then Gemini, and then most recently, CoinList. So we're excited to partner with you guys. This is a long partnership. We worked with you in the past for initial fundraisers using the SAF program and the work we've done there. And we continue to have a great engagement. So excited to be part of the family again in more ways.
Absolutely, yeah. It feels like this conversation is a long time coming here. So I want to come back to a couple of things you mentioned. Certainly the censorship and surveillance, because it feels like those are becoming increasingly important parts of the world's dialogue today. But maybe if we start a little bit earlier, you were at Pantera, you were investing in this space, you were seeing everything in crypto. It's certainly at that point, Pantera was far and away the leading fund in the space and was going into all of these really interesting projects. What inspired you to go and start Orchid, and why did you feel like that was the right path for you to go and do that yourself, as opposed to say, going and telling someone else to work on that?
Yeah, well, so two parts to that question. One is a personal journey. kind of growing up as a entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. My first job was really when I was 27 after finishing my PhD. So I was a late bloomer there compared to many people. I'd been involved in some entrepreneurial stuff while I was at Cambridge. We were doing speech recognition. So a lot of my friends ended up going into speech recognition companies, and guys like Nuance, and really the development of Siri and so on was done by a lot of people I know. So yeah, growing up and then sort of learning the entrepreneurial trade and going around the hallowed halls of VCs and begging for money and trying to get funding, all these kind of things, and going from a world where in the late 90s all you needed was a PowerPoint and some relationships with Oracle and Sun to get your funding. Oh, and an MBA that also helped. To then moving into a world in the beginnings of crypto where it wasn't clear that was starting to just evaporate, that necessity to kiss the ring, if you like, from the VCs. But my personal journey had been one where I'd taken a company public in 2011 on NASDAQ as CTO and co-founder. And then I really thought that the next career move was to get into investment. And I really enjoyed it. It was a fascinating experience, especially being on both essentially a hedge fund side with Bitcoin and other assets that we held. And then what I was most interested in was really building the companies and finding interesting companies. And over that period, even though it was fascinating and fun and built an incredible network, every time I found something I really liked, whether it was Zcash or like Vinny's company Civic, who were very early investors in, I was on the board of Bitstamp, and I just found myself wanting to just spend more and more time with the company I was engaged in. And yeah, you kind of like get the VC guy wants to come and hang out with the team. It's fun, but you're never really engaged. You're involved, you're invested, but you're kind of like a consultant with equity, right? So there was that side of it. I really wanted to go run something. And I felt like, having been on both sides of the table at this point, I started to understand, really the characteristics of what made successful companies work. We looked at hundreds and hundreds of companies over this period of time, a small fraction of which we invested in. And certainly the fund that we built has been doing well, and the companies some have exited, and we kind of like feel pretty good about it. So in 2016, it was also like a tough time to raise an venture fund. So we I personally spent years on the road, traveling all over the world, trying to convince people, and the conversation was just very much like, is this Bitcoin thing just all about dodgy stuff? Even as late as 2016. The other thing that really triggered me a lot was looking at and working with entrepreneurs and realizing from a currency perspective how Bitcoin was, a lot of it was about censorship resistance. It was about, instead of people deciding who could have the money and who could spend the money where, it was more open, it was more free. There wasn't this concept of, and I think we're starting to see that now with the trends in Bitcoin even today, in this current environment. So that was really starting to enlighten me. I'd always kind of had hanging out with security guys and sort of hackers, if you like, from some of my early work in the 2000s. I ran security for .com, so I knew a lot of characters from those kind of worlds. And and it was actually the thing that got me into Bitcoin, was chatting to some like hacker friends of mine, and they said, hey, you really should take a look at this. As we ran into the 2016 election and then the run up to that, our dear president became the leader. I was really concerned when I started seeing what was happening with, apparently the hacking of maybe hacking election machines, maybe other things. Even Twitter went down the week before the election. A lot of people didn't even notice that, but like the biggest news medium basically just went down for the weekend on DDoS attack. So this general idea that there's something wrong with the internet, there's something wrong with what we're building, and the idea that security and privacy weren't primary mechanisms that you built into your applications, they were secondary. If you look back in history, when the web started, HTTP was the base protocol, and it wasn't until later that we added on the security enhancement, which allowed you to do credit cards processing and actually have encrypted communications. my personal trigger with Orchid was actually getting phone ported. So in late 2016, I got phone ported, which is where someone SIM swaps you and tries to access all your accounts. They got part of the way through my systems, but not into the interesting and important ones. And that was really just like kind of a, as we might say in the West Coast, like a sign from the universe, or just kind of like a wake-up call, is like talking about this stuff and, you know, sitting on the sidelines, if you like, or investing in it is not enough. You got to go do something. So that really triggered me into thinking about what were the interesting kind of companies you could build in this space. My first idea was building a private cell phone carrier, one that was perhaps initially targeted at, you know, high net worth individuals, would be more expensive. Maybe you could even build in custom hardware, which some people have looked at doing. There's a thing called a black phone that was popular for a while, may still be. And then I was like, well, you kind of need like VPNs to really make that interesting. Like VPN should be just built in by default. And I think GoogleFi and other things have started to add some of those features. And then that led to this looking into the VPN space, and that was just a rabbit hole that I never really escaped from. And then combining that with what I understood about crypto and decentralized systems, and thinking about how VPNs, even though they're very helpful, are fundamentally centralized. Doing a lot of research into VPNs and realizing that many VPNs, actually part of their business model is to sell user data in aggregated format to hedge funds and other ad tech companies. That just seemed to be very antithetical to what these companies were supposed to stand for. And there are standout companies that don't do that, but yeah, that was really where the idea came from.
Yeah, it's a great story, and it all makes a lot of sense. It feels like in a lot of ways, this censorship resistance is kind of core tenet of this entire space, and the sequence that these things go through is that you've got some sort of transaction that happens in the real world, and then it moves to the digital world, and then it is able to move to this more secure, censorship-resistant implementation of it. And so you have, you know, perhaps Bitcoin or other crypto assets being money, and then digital money started to exist, and now this censorship-resistant digital money exists. And you have things like file storage, where there are files in the real world, and there's digital files, and now there's things like Filecoin and IPFS that are supporting censorship-resistant digital files. And to me, what Orchid's doing is so core to that thesis, that there are transactions that happen in the real world, then those transactions move online, and that traffic moves online of communicating information and data. And then the natural conclusion of that is, well, let's build a way for this to happen in a truly censorship-resistant way, and fulfill the ideals of the space, and fulfill humans' real needs and solve real problems out there, which to me has always been one of the most interesting things about Orchid.
Yeah,
so I want to.
That's a good characterization of it.
Yeah. So when I think about Orchid, there's kind of three components of it that, at least for me, I tend to think of. There's this fundamental technology, some really core distributed systems technology allowing the system to actually work. There's the product that you're building that I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, that people can actually use. And then, you know, there's this token, and there's this incentive layer that allows that whole system to work. Could you talk through just briefly each of those three categories: technology and product and the incentive system, and how you see this all fitting together to make this product work?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so from the technology side, there's some interesting things we've done. So it's a fully compatible ERC20 token, so it's built within the Ethereum framework. It's tempting to look at that as like, oh, well, that's the obvious thing to do. We actually spent a long time looking at alternative ways to do it, even with layer one technology or other blockchains that were available. Fundamentally, we were looking for characteristics from the goals that we would set of what's the most decentralized, scalable, and secure blockchain that's available at the time. And so at the time we were building this, and time that we launched, that was Ethereum. The story remains today that that's the case. And also the other thing we're looking for there is compatibility and extensibility of the existing developer framework. And certainly when we launched a network, even personally doing a lot of work and integrating it with existing tools at the time of launching, it was a lot easier than if we'd had our own blockchain and building our own application with that blockchain and so on. So that was a significant advantage to use that thing. There's challenges there with using Ethereum, and one of the biggest challenges, and certainly was one of the conversation points over the years we're building, was how do you get scalability? So when we think of scalability, we're not trying to like make CryptoKitties run a bit faster. We're trying to do data networking speeds. So we're trying to put in payments with packets. So when you think of kind of the complexity of doing this, there's a lot of subtleties that we built in, a lot of like really behind the scenes engineering that go into building network security systems. And this is what we built. It's network secure systems, VPN technology. Our system is, you can think of it as a meta VPN. So when you're using a client, I'm jumping into how the client works, we've got clients right now for iOS, Android, and we've got command line versions. We're going to have some desktop versions in the next couple of weeks, I believe. And those clients are paying for routes across a network of node providers. And those node providers are doing basically the same thing as you'd think of a normal VPN would be doing. But instead of getting paid through a credit card subscription or some other account that you set up with that VPN provider, they're getting paid directly using OXT, which is our currency. So as they provide routes, they get rewarded using the currency. The users of the clients are paying with OXT. Now, if we were to do all of this on chain and put every single transaction into each packet, like you forget about CryptoKitties, this thing would just like Ethereum would go, we'd shut down the network pretty rapidly. So that was a fundamental scalability challenge that we had to overcome. So what we've done is you can think of the payments that actually go into each packet as a little bit like a ticket, like a lottery ticket. We call them probabilistic nanopayments. It's kind of a long phrase, but tickets is another way to think about it. The tickets that, if you're a provider, the tickets that you're getting, most of them are worth nothing. Like there's like, you're cashing in these tickets, you're like, oh, this one's worth nothing, this one's worth nothing. And then suddenly you get one, you're like, oh, this one's worth like a lot. Wow, this is great. And the expected value of the tickets that you're getting over time is the same as if we did a single transaction on chain. So we've got scalability and then the payment guarantee that you're looking for. Now, other people try to solve this, you know, other distributed VPNs. Most of them have tried to solve it by doing something different, which is they say, okay, we're gonna pay you, like you could say as a node provider, I'm gonna give you traffic, and then at the end of the month, you gotta pay me. And then at the end of the month, I could be like, see ya, I'm out of here. Or I could do the way around, which is that I give you the money up front and then you give me the traffic, but then you could just say, see you and disappear. And so by having this ability to put the payments in very small data packets, we're able to solve this scalability issue, but also give the system some very important guarantees, which actually makes it so that you don't have to put in things like reputation and so on. That's what most people think about, that you need reputation models in the system. Reputation models are important for other reasons, but they're not a necessity if you get this kind of architecture correct. So that's kind of like a long question, but other uses of the OXT is each of the node providers in the system stakes OXT. So they put down a stake of OXT, and what the stake is for, it's a bit different to something like proof of stake. The stake is actually a form of advertising. So the more OXT that's being staked by a provider, the more traffic that provider is going to get according to the client routing algorithm. And so you could say, well, you know, if I've got like just this little VPN node in the system, I could just stake tons and tons of OXT and get tons and tons of traffic. Well, yeah, you would, but you'd also overwhelm your connection. And then the system would start looking at and saying, I don't want to send traffic here because it's just not working, or the users may disconnect. So the amount of OXT you want to stake is in proportion to the amount of capability that your node has. If you have a small node, you're going to want to stake a small amount of OXT. If you stake too much, you're wasting OXT because you could have done something else with that money. If you stake too little, you're wasting your data center capability because you could have taken in more connections and more revenue.
Yeah, no, I think this there's a lot to dig into there, because the token economic model for Orchid, I think, is really thoughtfully done, and that's something that at CoinList we're always digging into. And so often we talk to teams that have a really compelling team, a great product, they're attacking a big market, everything looks good, but the token model itself just doesn't quite get there. And I think what you're talking about is really interesting, that your goal is to, with this model, incentivize all the right people appropriately. Make sure that every single party on the network that is important to the functioning of the network, whether it's someone running a VPN node or it's someone routing traffic, that they're properly incentivized to use the network and behave well on the network, and that there's appropriate disincentives to prevent people from abusing the network in any way. And that's something that I think a lot of teams miss when they're coming up with their token model. And so can you talk a little bit about the team and who is it that has contributed to coming up with that model? Who is it that's building the technology? What's the team you've built around you to execute on this censorship and surveillance-free vision that you're working towards?
Yeah, so I think to call out my business partner and CTO and co-founder, Jay Freeman. So Jay has an amazing reputation within network security. He developed the first feature app store for the iPhone, for actually jailbroken iPhones, and his handle Soric is pretty well known by many people in that community. He built out Cydia, which is this framework for adding features to jailbroken iPhones. And he's really been one of the core of network security, an overall CTO and architect of the system. Greg Hazel, who worked on FireChat, which is a Bluetooth messenger system used in one of the previous revolutionary uprisings in Hong Kong, I think around like 10 years ago. He was also involved very, very heavily in the network security aspect. So co-founders also included Gustav Sørensen, who worked on the core security framework of Ethereum, and Brian Fox, who was first employed at the Free Software Foundation. We got some amazing other people in the team on the tech side, Justin Sheik and Jake Cannell, and many others. So kind of like really excited to have a really incredible team behind us on the tech stack. And we're also hiring. So if anybody else wants to join the cause, we are still building out the team, looking for amazing people. We've got about a 25-person team total, including consultants. We're fully distributed, decentralized model, especially today. And we've been very focused, I think we can kind of touch on this point too, very focused on the relevance of this kind of technology during this period, and I'm working very hard to improve it for everybody.
Yeah, so also it's worth noting, I think, that it's a team with a lot of experience. You've erred on the side of bringing people that have built things that are meaningful before, and I think that can be a little bit unusual in this space too sometimes. We've talked a little bit about this technology and how the Orchid system works as a whole, but at the end of the day, people have to use it, and real users have to point traffic through the network. So what is it that you or the community is doing to build out products that people actually use, and what's the status of those efforts?
Yes, as I mentioned, we're live now on Android. We're in iOS on test flight. We've got command line versions, and we'll be rolling out desktop versions in terms of GUIs very soon. We've been working very hard on interfaces. Currently, the primary payment interface is using crypto. You have to load an OXT, you have to load an Ethereum into a dApp. But to make that easier to transfer, we developed some QR code scanning capabilities so that it's easy just to point your app from your phone to, for example, to the dApp and import that account. That QR code capability also allows you to share that account across multiple devices that you own. So maybe if you've got an iOS or an Android app and you've got an account loaded into there, you can share that to your desktop quite easily. And it's quite a unique feature even in the VPN space. It's still early days, of course. We only launched in December, and we consider this period very much working with the community to figure out what use cases are the best ones for us to explore. There are many different use cases of VPNs. We're trying to build something that has wide applicability, and but kind of also like being very agile and so on to figure out which use cases seem very interesting. Currently, for example, the client doesn't explicitly support something like geolocating, which a lot of VPNs do. And so as a meta VPN, that's a capability we're looking at. It's very easy to build into the system right now using the current technology basically by supporting, for anybody who's like wants to dig into it more, is by using custom curators in the Orchid client. The Orchid client, in order to determine where to send traffic to, actually looks through a smart contract, which is it checks to see which nodes or set of nodes that smart contract curator considers good nodes to send the traffic to. And this is a kind of interesting subtlety that we've been exploring a lot. Most people tend to think of cryptocurrency systems or systems that use them as fully trustless. Like, yeah, that is true for the transfer of value. But when it comes to the service part of it, as we talked about before, if we'd set this up in a way where you could just leave after providing some service, that wouldn't be such a good idea. There are other considerations to have there. So even though it's a full system-wide VPN, there could be certain kinds of attacks that you as a node might put on me as a client. For example, JavaScript injection into the browser if you're just running HTTP, or other kinds of malicious things you could do. Some of those are somewhat mitigated using our technology, but it's still important in our system that you kind of trust the nodes that you're sending the data to. So the way we get around that is to have a smart contract curator, and then you can list the nodes that you trust. So initially, the set of nodes that we started on our curator has been 7 different VPN companies that we vetted. So essentially, it's like the Orchid curated list. And the companies like Private Internet Access, for example, is one of our curated nodes. But this isn't the end of the game here. So what the idea is that anyone can build their own curator. So you can imagine it's being set up in a kind of DAO incentivized structure, where someone like the EFF or Internet Archive or somebody else who you trust would then vet a set of nodes and perhaps like have an economic relationship with those companies, but also have the ability to slash their stake and move them out of the list if they decided that they were not the right person. When it comes to geolocation, the idea is that you could have an interface which says, I want to only target my traffic to the UK. And then the set of nodes that would be in the curator then would be nodes that are running in the UK that you trust. So those are some of the sort of things we're thinking about, innovations as to how to better serve the needs of people who are using it. Currently today, it's very useful in environments such as we have people running it in Dubai and other countries that are behind firewalls, where what they really want to do is get access to kind of US or generally globally available content. And so we're seeing a lot of usage there and a lot of growth in those markets. And to support that, every time we've expanded, like when we expanded with OKX and Bittrex, we translated the app, the websites, even the white paper into those languages. So we're now in Mandarin, Japanese, Indonesian, Russian. Trying to think of the other ones. Yeah, most of the languages supported so far.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that because I think it's a really interesting strategy. Most consumer-facing products take a really tiny geographic slice of the market first, and we'll say, we're only targeting the United States first, or we're only targeting, San Francisco first. We're really trying to specific geographic area, and only once we've reached some level of saturation there will we move to the next one, And people usually hold off on translating their product for a very long time and say, can we move to all English-speaking nations once we've gotten beyond the US and then translate? How have you thought about the decision to take what I see as a very different approach, which is let's get this in as many languages as possible and kind of reach as many different places across the world as possible?
When you put it that way, it sounds like it was a bad idea, but
well, I don't know about that. It seems to be working.
Yeah, it's it's got its challenges, but I guess I look at it as we don't think of this as a specifically geographically focused problem. We see the problem with censorship and surveillance as a global problem, and we also see cryptocurrency as a global application. and a global community. As we grow, and like I said, it's still early days yet, we may end up putting a lot of resources into, for example, Indonesia, which has one of the markets we're very excited about, has 42% VPN usage. It's one of, I think it's the fourth or fifth largest country in the world. I'm trying to remember my stats. I think it's 4. And so if we see a lot of traction in that market, we could definitely start, for example, increasing marketing budget in those regions, or increasing partnerships, or increasing support in that region. But I guess it feels, I mean, maybe it's just also from my background, just living in a lot of places and being very sort of globally aware. I just think like, if you're going to be agile in figuring out where to invest resources as a startup, which we still think of ourselves as, then kind of having coverage and seeing where you get traction is an interesting approach, so that you can actually then really go for it. If we just focus on San Francisco, I mean, I think VPN usage in San Francisco is something that people should be more aware of, but the Western use case is sort of less well understood by most people. We live in a relatively free society, and our awareness of digital surveillance is mostly concerning around things that even when we use VPNs, we continue to do, such as using our Facebook accounts or our Google accounts. And so we continue to opt into those things even if we're using VPNs. So in other parts of the world, this is really a much more important and necessary part of life. And in many cases, people are sitting around trying to figure out which VPN should they use in order to actually get it to work and get access to content that's part of their daily life.
Yeah, it does feel like on that Orchid was early on this trend, 2016, 2017, that censorship and surveillance were becoming issues. And it feels like that, the awareness of that is really increasing. And particularly, I'd say in the last 12 or so months, people have started to think about that. Can you talk a little bit about where you see that going, what you think the world looks like today with respect to censorship and surveillance, and where you think that's going, and how Orchid might be able to fit into that?
Yeah, so I think it was, so around the specific, we're kind of dancing around this, but around the specific issue that the world's facing today on, what is it, May 7th, 2020, for the historians who look at this in the future. So with COVID-19 and what's still locked down in many parts of the world, the Western world certainly, I started looking and tracking COVID in around mid-January, and it was in response to something that I started doing for the first time in my life. I decided to start an email newsletter, so I started sending it out to friends of mine and people I knew. And one of the things that caught my attention was this virus that was spreading, coming out of China. Not particularly because I was some futurist who knew what was going to happen, because I certainly didn't know how bad this was going to get, but because of the censorship that had been done around the disclosure. I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but the doctor, one of the doctors who originally tracked this virus and discovered it in a hospital in Wuhan, talked about it on WeChat, and in a broader context on WeChat, not just with a couple of friends, but in a WeChat group, and was taken away by the police and warned very heavily, and had to make a public detraction of his comments, I think in late December. And if you look at this and say, well, what if he had been able to actually get the word out more carefully? What if people in the West had found out about this more, like a month earlier? That would have been really cool. Maybe we'd be a month ahead of the situation. So I don't know how the world would have played out if that had been different, but you could look at it and say, specifically, that issue around censorship was of global harm, right? It's affected all of us. China, signal them out a little bit here, but China has now been receiving praise from its authoritarian, surveillance-focused approach to shutting things down and tracking things. The Chinese government had Alibaba release an app which gave you a QR code based on the color of the QR code basically said, this is what you're allowed to do. You're allowed to kind of either leave the house or you're not, or you have to stay home. Put in like very significant, or they already have very significant surveillance, but they exercised that surveillance regime in order to what we believe is effectively contain the virus, even though, again, within the context of censorship, it's not quite clear whether some of the numbers are actually true or not. But that's a whole rabbit hole we go down. So you kind of like, that's how I got activated into thinking about what was happening around censorship surveillance within this context. Fast forward to today, and now we're seeing countries being concerned about how do they open up their societies, how do they open up their economies. And one of the things that's being touted as the solution, and if you look into what was done very effectively in South Korea, there was a lot of apparatus put in place for cell phone location tracking tied to databases of who had tested positive. And so if you kind of combine those two things and say, oh, well, it's like a digital version of what's called contact tracing, which is a sort of a tried and trusted approach in the spread of epidemics, has been used for many, many years in this space. So now we have Google and Apple partnering on what they call digital contact tracing. And they have an approach which is a little bit more decentralized than other people. It's definitely more decentralized than, say, the approach that's being pushed forward by the United Kingdom, where I'm from originally. But as a general balancing act, what we have right now is that in the past, we might have been looking at pushing through bills that and laws that allowed more surveillance and less privacy from the perspective of national security. And not to criticize the Patriot Act, but if you kind of like look over the period of time, the Patriot Act and the EFF has a great what's the right phrase? A great kind of picture of talking about some of these infographic, that's the word, talking about the actual effectiveness of the Patriot Act and how many sort of search and seizures of digital information actually led to the capture of somebody who was threatening national security. And it's like very, very small number, in fact it's like, if any. And so now instead, we've got something that people can point to and say, well, this issue, public health, is affecting me. It's affecting someone I know. It's affecting a family member. And I've unfortunately known people who passed away from this. And so it becomes much more triggering to you. And so if we see a bill go through, for example, the Earn It bill, which is about people are trying to pass right now, which is basically an end-to-end encryption bill, I can imagine that getting rewritten within the context of COVID and people saying, oh, I totally support that now. Yeah, let's push that through. And whilst that may be good for public health, and I don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of like making sure public health is better. You have to look at what the long-term consequences of those things are, because no one's going around repealing the Patriot Act. That thing gets passed every time. It's like they just pass it across the aisles. They don't care. It's like Democrats and Republicans, they pass it each time when it gets renewed. I worry about the new things, the new regulations. As a specific example, Germany, who's really been one of the last bastions of digital freedom, like very digital privacy in the Western world, ruled to change GDPR, which has been hailed as generally a privacy positive piece of regulation, has some issues, but they've now repealed part of it. They've got an extension to it which says that in the case of an epidemic, aspects of GDPR can be changed such that it allows for cell phone location and other kinds of digital tracking. And that sounds okay until Angela Merkel moves on, and then maybe we have a slightly more right-wing version of her or someone else in power in Germany, and then they define what an epidemic is. Hey, it's flu season, it's an epidemic. Guess what? We're going to track you from now on. And there's examples of this, like Egypt's been in a state of emergency for like 20 years now, and it just never stops being in a state of emergency.
Yeah, there's a lot to dig into there. That's another 3-hour conversation of interesting things. One thing I do want to call out that you said early in that answer that I think is underrated by a lot of people is that censorship in one place can lead to very material effects in other places. And that's true for surveillance too. The example you're giving of the doctor, censorship anywhere in the world can lead to effects where you are, no matter if the place that you're in is the most free and uncensored place in the world. And I think that's underrated sometimes. I think sometimes people look around and say, wherever they are, I'm fine. I'm not being affected meaningfully. And whether or not that's right in the first place, it doesn't mean that that the effects of censorship elsewhere in the world are not impacting them, which I think is an important and underrated
like
point.
what if it was the disposal of nuclear waste in a country and that information got censored? That's definitely going to affect a lot of people too. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, we'll shoot more time here. We've got time for a couple of questions, and there's been a bunch from the audience. So we'll dig into a couple of these, and then we'll wrap up. And then we're both online on Twitter for all the follow-ups that I'm sure will happen. But a couple questions from the audience. First, well, first of all, an easy one. Can you have the recording after the event? Yes, we will publish this recording after the event. Don't worry about it. One from Victor, talking about the way how Orchid is using the Ethereum blockchain. Seems a little familiar on how Uber built their app on top of Google Maps. And the question is the quality of Orchid dependent on the Ethereum network continuing to succeed? And if so, do you see any issues there? Is there anything you're concerned about? Or how are you getting comfortable building on top of Ethereum?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of answered that a little bit earlier, which was that in choosing a blockchain and choosing whether to do with Ethereum or even build our own blockchain, the things we were looking for were from launch very decentralized and decentralized by design, which is a subtlety we get into. As to people argue that lots of blockchains decentralized, and you could argue that even with the Ethereum mining concentration, maybe it's not as decentralized as you'd like, but it's actually fundamentally decentralized by design. There's no sort of centralized voting mechanism that votes a certain group of your friends in to decide whether blocks are approved or not. So it has that quality. I think that the fact that it's such a wide support amongst developers, and even if you go to DevCon versus trying to go to any other layer one conference, you'll see that in person. Just look at the attendee numbers and the quality of the people who are focused on this, and the quality of people who are focused on moving it to the next phase, either sort of Ethereum 2 or other variants of this. I think the real question in terms of transition is that we all know that there's going to be a transition from Ethereum 1 to something else. So as we think about this, for now, Ethereum 1 is definitely a placeholder for us and is a placeholder for everybody. And so the layer one smart contract platforms that emerge over the next couple of years will all be competing for essentially developers and applications to have them move on to their network. And so that's going to be a pragmatic decisions that we're going to have to make. I'm pretty cognizant of what's happening in Ethereum 2, and I'm an advisor of Web3, so I know the kind of work that the guys at Polkadot are doing. I don't think that any of these competitive layer one designs are necessarily a strong negative in the next couple of years to Ethereum. But like any system that's out there, its success is going to depend on the degree of innovation that happens on it and to the extent that it continues to serve the needs of applications such as ourselves that are working on it. We'd like to see other capabilities in layer one design, such as support for zero knowledge proofs that doesn't burn up tons of gas cost. And that's certainly some of the things that we've looked at personally as to ways to improve systems like that. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. One last one before we wrap up here from the very creatively named First Last. Could you give a little context on, and we were touching on this earlier, I guess, thinking about the kind of token and the economic model. Why isn't OXT a stable coin? I think this is a question that a lot of kind of functional tokens end up getting faced with. What drove the decision to make OXT this kind of floating price asset as part of this system, and why do you think it's the most effective design?
It's an interesting question. I can see how, from a consumer perspective, you might say it makes more sense for something to be built with a stable coin and the sort of protocol aspect of it. I think that adds complexity. Another question we get asked around this question is, why don't you have subscriptions as part of the protocol? Like, why isn't the system just basically a subscription thing? Because people in VPN space are used to subscriptions. And I'm like, well, pay as you go is just kind of the simplest thing you could do. you can always build subscriptions on top of that. And I think that you can always build a stablecoin implementation on top of this. You could imagine DAI or USDT or something like that being used as the mechanism of paying. But the kind of core aspect of it seems to make most sense to have something simple, which is just using a floating currency. From a client perspective, consumer perspective, with its current implementation, you could argue that, well, if I hold a bunch of XT and then it goes down in price, then I'm getting less bandwidth than I was expecting, or I bought a bunch of XT and then it goes up in price, then the bandwidth providers may be getting a different result, right? So yeah, I kind of get that, but I think that most people, they're buying XT and then they're using it, and I don't see people building out, lifetime supplies of XT and squirreling away on the mattresses. We think it'd be a good idea, but it's that's not investment advice, obviously. But yeah, I think just trying to keep things simple is really how we've designed the architecture. And that doesn't mean that future extensions couldn't be by the community. I think even looking back to things like how simple, relatively simple things like Ethereum were designed as core building blocks, and now we have stablecoins. It's like, well, we can always build new things on top of simple building blocks. But if you build the simple building blocks in a way that they stop you from being able to do different kinds of things, it may be that designing things as a stablecoin actually prevents you from building other interesting things that would have been impossible.
That's really interesting. I think the analogy to Ethereum is very interesting. That yes, you can have a floating price asset. Maybe one day there will be a stablecoin built on top of OXT or based on it, and that'll have kind of a similar architecture as DAI or something else. That's a really interesting idea. I was going to ask you a last question of what's next for Orchid, but someone just slotted in a question which is even better. So we'll close on this. How does Orchid become 10 times better than the existing available options for VPNs for the average consumer? How do you get there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one way to look at it, what we're doing is that, like I said before, it's on the one hand, it's currently like a meta VPN, which is that it's able to aggregate lots of different existing VPN providers and also enable anybody to start up their own VPN business, for example. So whether it's, you've got a friend in China and you're going to run a node for them, and then you just set up a custom circuit that only has a few nodes in it, but it's people it's like you and your mate and so on, and friends of this guy. And you could even set the OXT price to like basically very little, because you just give them your friend the bandwidth. But then maybe it turns out that, you tell some of his friends, the next thing you know, you got like hundreds of people, thousands of people want to access the node. And like, hang on a second, I got to like put this in the data center. So you put it in a data center. There's nothing that needs to change for you. You might have to have better accounting and support, but you can go from that simple use case to scaling this thing. And we think that's a really interesting opportunity, and it's certainly not something that you'd be able to do. You'd have to put tons of marketing into this normally and so on. With Orchid, as long as you're able to convince some people, well, obviously with some marketing also, you can just stake more OXT and start getting this thing, get more traffic. So we think that's interesting from the node provider standpoint. It's always a bit challenging to talk about roadmaps, especially in the current climate. But I think that's, and certainly something we've talked about in our white paper, some of the things we're looking at in sort of improvements to the networking protocol and general capabilities is the idea that the Orchid network can become more than just a VPN. One example here is it's the idea of programmable transports. So if you're trying to traverse a firewall, you can start up with a new protocol that no one's seen, and then the firewall will be like, hey, I've not seen this before, I'll just let this traffic go through. It looks like Zoom traffic, that's great. And then after a while, it's like, hang on a second. Then someone tells them, or they find the application and they deconstruct it and they say, well, I'm going to put new rules in here. So maybe what you need is something where you and I can actually agree upon a new protocol that we just change a little bit, and then in my client, we can change it, and you can change it in your server. So that's something we've been looking at, is the idea of, and other freely available systems have some of these ideas, but the idea of, could you upload a new algorithm to change the way the network works, and how would that look? And that's sort of somewhere we start thinking this system could be really exciting and move beyond just simple VPNs. We also think the idea of people being able to take everything, because everything is open source, including the iOS client, which is pretty rare. Most people have the server open source, something. Ours, the whole thing is open source. So someone else can take this code, integrate it into their client, and then hopefully they use the Orchid network, but they may fork it and do something different with it. But we believe that the way you designed our system has sufficient support that it would be more interesting to use our network. And then they can integrate it into their applications. And then instead of you having to start up your separate VPN just when you start up your messaging client, it automatically goes secure and gives you that private connection. So we think that's where it can get really interesting.
Well, there's clearly a lot of work to do, so we will let you get back to it. Thank you, as always, for taking the time. We always love our conversations here. And for everyone who's watching, you can check out Orchid on CoinList, coinlist.co, and you can buy and sell Orchid right there in the interface. Really excited to be partnering with Orchid as we have for a long time, and keep building this. If you have questions, you can find either of us on Twitter, and obviously companies as well. And we will see you in the next episode of CoinList Chats. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Amy.
Thanks.